Judge Thomas Richards had seen it all in his career, thousands of cases, each with their own intricacies, yet none had ever left him quite as unsettled as the one unfolding in front of him that morning. Alexis Mitchell, a woman in her early 30s, stood at the defendant's table, her gaze steady, her posture confident. To Richards, she seemed more like an idealistic young woman who had perhaps taken one too many liberties with her passion for social change. He had heard about her protest, an event organized by her group to draw attention to an upcoming city ordinance he knew well. It had been described as disruptive, an inconvenience to the public. The charges were simple: unauthorized assembly and disturbing the peace. But Alexis wasn't here to apologize or justify her actions in a traditional sense. Instead, she looked directly at Richards with a calm that surprised him. She wasn't nervous or guilty or even angry. She was resolute. As she spoke, her words cut through the sterile formality of the courtroom. This protest was not a mere interruption, she said, her voice clear and strong. It was an urgent call for change. It was a voice for those who've been overlooked, for those who've been unheard for too long. Richards, who had spent years upholding the laws of the land with an unwavering belief in their importance, listened intently, but with a growing sense of unease. This wasn't the first time someone had made the case for justice reform, but there was something different about Alexis's delivery. Her words weren't angry or accusatory, but rather, she spoke with a quiet intensity, almost as if she were explaining something that was self-evident to her. The more she spoke, the more Richards felt the walls of his convictions begin to tremble, as if her message was slowly infiltrating a part of him he didn't know existed. Yet, despite the weight of her message, Richards remained unmoved. He was a man of the law, and the law, as far as he was concerned, was clear. No one was above it. Not even someone who might have good intentions. After Alexis finished speaking, there was a brief silence in the courtroom. Richards cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses, and then, without hesitation, delivered his ruling. "You've made a compelling argument, Ms. Mitchell, but the law is the law," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "You organized a gathering without the proper permits, and regardless of your reasoning, that cannot go unpunished. I am imposing a fine of $2,000. Alexis didn't flinch. Her expression didn't change. She simply nodded, as though she had expected nothing less. But in that moment, as she stood to leave the courtroom, Richards couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this was more than just a simple legal case. Something about Alexis Mitchell was different. She wasn't just defending her actions. She was standing for a future he hadn't yet fully understood. The gavel fell, but in the stillness that followed, Richards couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of something far larger than either of them could yet grasp. Alexis Mitchell had grown accustomed to being misunderstood. It wasn't new to her. From a young age, she'd learned that standing up for what was right often meant standing alone. She didn't mind the solitude, though. It had shaped her into the person she was today, unshakable in her belief that the justice system needed to change. Her childhood hadn't been easy. Raised in a small neighborhood where opportunities were scarce, Alexis had always been keenly aware of the disparities around her. She grew up watching as those around her struggled with issues that seemed small to most but were monumental to them. Unequal access to education, over-policing, and the constant threat of injustice lurking in every aspect of daily life. It was these experiences that led Alexis to pursue law, driven by a desire to make a tangible difference. Throughout law school, Alexis faced many obstacles. She was often one of the few women of color in her classes, and professors or peers would sometimes challenge her with subtle and not so subtle insinuations about her place in the legal world. But Alexis didn't let the doubts of others hold her back. Instead, they became fuel for her mission, her belief that the law, in its current form, was deeply flawed. She saw it not as an impartial system, but as one that, too often, tilted in favor of those with privilege and power. After graduation, Alexis founded her nonprofit organization, one dedicated to legal reform and equal access to justice. It wasn't easy. She fought to raise awareness, trying to get others to see the disparities that plagued the system. She held workshops, offered free legal consultations, and advocated tirelessly for policy changes. But it wasn't enough. Alexis realized that for real change to occur, it wasn't just about offering legal services, it was about challenging the system at its core. Her protest, the one that had led her into Judge Richard's courtroom, had been one such challenge. What had started as a simple rally to draw attention to a controversial city ordinance had spiraled into something much larger. The city government had announced the ordinance without consulting the public or considering its impact on marginalized communities. Alexis had known she couldn't sit by quietly. She mobilized a group of people to peacefully assemble, to make their voices heard, to demand that their concerns be addressed. When the protest was deemed unlawful, when the fine was imposed, Alexis didn't feel defeated. Instead, she felt even more resolute. This was exactly the kind of injustice she had been fighting against her entire life. A system that didn't listen, didn't adapt, and punished those who dared to challenge it. To her, the fine wasn't a setback. It was another symbol of why her work was so necessary. In the days that followed, Alexis didn't back down. She knew that what had happened in that courtroom wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been told to remain quiet, everyone who had ever been overlooked. She would not be silenced. If anything, the fine only proved the importance of her mission. Her resolve grew stronger with each passing day, and she prepared for the next phase of her journey, to prove that her fight for justice was not just an isolated cause, but the beginning of something much bigger. Judge Thomas Richards had always prided himself on being impartial. He believed in the sanctity of the law, in its power to bring order, fairness, and justice. As a career judge, he had seen countless cases and was often able to separate emotion from the facts. But the fine he had imposed on Alexis Mitchell gnawed at him in a way he couldn't explain. It wasn't the first time a protest had come before him, nor was it the first time he had to make a tough decision. What unsettled him was that this time, despite the clarity of the legal facts, he felt uncertain. In the days following the court hearing, Richards found himself replaying Alexis's words in his mind. It was an urgent call for change. It was a voice for those who've been overlooked, she had said. He had dismissed her words at the time, focusing on the legality of her actions rather than the substance of her message. But now, in the silence of his chambers, those words lingered, echoing in his thoughts. It wasn't that Richards had never questioned the system before. He was aware of the criticisms surrounding the justice system. He knew about the disparity in sentencing, the racial imbalances, the criticisms of the way the law disproportionately affected certain groups. But those problems always seemed abstract, something distant that didn't truly touch his world. They were issues he read about in articles, debated in academic circles, but never something he felt personally involved in. But Alexis wasn't an abstract concept. She was real. And her protest, while inconvenient, wasn't born out of chaos or hatred. It was born out of a deep desire for change. Richards had seen the fire in her eyes when she spoke. It was a fire that matched the conviction he had once felt early in his career, back when he believed the law could solve everything. It was the quiet confidence in Alexis's voice that continued to echo in his mind. She hadn't asked for his approval, and yet there was something about the way she carried herself, her belief in her cause, that made him question whether he had made the right call. In his years on the bench, he had always believed the law was a black and white matter. There were rules, and if you broke them, you faced consequences. But was it really that simple? Was justice simply about enforcing rules, or was there more to it? Late one evening, unable to shake his doubts, Richards pulled up articles on Alexis Mitchell. He read about her work, her childhood in a tough neighborhood, her law degree, and her rise as a leader in advocating for change. The more he read, the more he realized just how deeply her fight for justice was rooted in her personal experiences. And the more he began to wonder, was his decision really about the law, or was it about something else? Something deeper, something harder to define. The next day, as he sat in his chambers, Richards found himself unable to ignore the unsettling thought that perhaps, just perhaps, there was something he had missed, something important about the law, about justice, and about his role in shaping it. In the weeks following the court hearing, Alexis Mitchell's name began to circulate far beyond the walls of the courthouse. What started as a small protest had sparked a conversation that many had tried to avoid for years. Alexis had become a voice not just for the few who had attended her demonstration, but for anyone who had ever felt powerless or ignored by the systems they trusted. Instead of retreating after being fined, Alexis used the attention the case had garnered to fuel her mission. She appeared on local news stations, speaking eloquently about the need for reform in the justice system. Her message resonated with many, people who had never thought about the legal system in such a personal way. Alexis wasn't just another activist rallying against the system. She was articulating the lived experiences of countless individuals who faced injustice daily. Her social media following grew rapidly. Clips of her speeches and interviews spread across platforms, drawing admiration from activists, young professionals, and everyday people alike. Alexis wasn't just talking about problems. She was offering solutions. She spoke about bridging the gaps between communities and the justice system, about the need for transparency, and how the law should be a tool for empowerment, not a mechanism of oppression. One of her most powerful pieces was an op-ed she wrote for a local newspaper, titled "Justice for All, Not Just for the Few." In it, she eloquently described her own experiences growing up in a neighborhood where the justice system often felt like a distant and indifferent entity. She spoke of how that feeling had shaped her understanding of the law, not as a neutral force, but as something that often played a role in perpetuating inequality. The piece was shared thousands of times, sparking debates across social media and bringing attention to the larger conversation of legal reform. Soon, key political figures began to take notice. They reached out to Alexis, asking to meet with her and discuss the potential for change. What had once been a lone voice advocating for reform was now part of a growing movement. She found herself sitting in rooms with lawmakers, discussing policies and proposals that could lead to tangible change. Alexis had become a symbol of hope for many, a leader who wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo. Judge Richards, too, couldn't ignore the growing influence of Alexis. He followed her progress with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. She wasn't the simple protester he had imagined. She was proving that there was power in speaking out, in challenging the very systems that had always been upheld without question. The more he heard her speak, the more he began to feel the weight of his own decisions. In private, Richard started to read more about Alexis's initiatives, how she was working with local community groups to address issues like unequal sentencing and police practices. The more he learned, the more he found himself questioning his previous assumptions. Alexis's words were no longer just a fleeting thought. They were starting to seem like a call to action. He found himself pondering whether he could have made a different decision in her case, one that might have acknowledged the larger issues she was fighting to bring into the light. As Alexis's influence grew, so did the pressure on the system to listen. The conversation had shifted, and it wasn't going away. And deep down, Richards knew that this was only the beginning. It was an evening event at a local charity gala, an annual gathering of the city's legal and political elite. Judge Richards wasn't thrilled about attending. He preferred the quiet of his chambers over the social circles he'd long been a part of. But as the invitation had come from an old colleague, he felt obliged to show up. It was the kind of gathering where everyone shook hands, exchanged pleasantries, and talked about the same issues in polished, rehearsed tones. But that evening, something was different. As he stood by the bar, nursing a glass of wine, he heard a voice behind him. "Judge Richards, it's nice to finally meet you in person." He turned to find Alexis Mitchell standing before him, offering a warm but knowing smile. She was poised, elegant even, in her dress, completely at ease in a room full of influential figures. Despite the stark contrast between their worlds, Alexis' presence seemed to command the same level of respect as any of the others in the room. "I didn't expect to see you here," Richards said, slightly taken aback. "Funny, I didn't expect to see you either," Alexis replied with a laugh. "But I'm glad we're both here." Their conversation began with small talk: who was attending, what the event was for. But it soon shifted to more serious matters. Richards could sense the energy Alexis exuded, the same energy that had come through in her speeches and interviews. It wasn't just the message she was delivering that had caught the public's attention. It was her ability to connect with people, to make them feel as though they were part of something larger than themselves. There was a quiet authority in the way she spoke, and for the first time, Richards realized that it wasn't just her cause that was powerful, it was her. "I've been reading about your work," Richards admitted, as their conversation turned to the current state of the justice system. "Your initiatives are gaining quite a bit of traction." Alexis smiled but didn't seem surprised. Change is inevitable when enough people demand it. It's just a matter of when and how. Richards nodded thoughtfully, then added, "I've been following the conversation, and I'm starting to understand your perspective more. I don't know if I would have made the same decisions in your position, but you've certainly given me something to think about." Alexis looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing her next words carefully. "I'm glad to hear that," she said softly. "You're in a position to make real change, Judge. If you're open to it, we could work together." The offer caught him off guard. Work together. He was a judge, a man of the law. He had spent decades upholding the system. Wasn't that enough? But as Alexis spoke, as she outlined her vision for reform, Richards found himself intrigued. She didn't ask him to abandon his role, but instead, she invited him to see it from a different perspective, a perspective rooted in empathy and fairness. As the night wore on, they continued to talk, discussing everything from sentencing reform to new approaches for community engagement. The more Richards listened, the more he felt the old, rigid walls around his beliefs begin to shift. Maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong in his earlier assumptions. Maybe there was more to justice than the laws themselves. And for the first time in a long while, Richards began to wonder if he could be part of something bigger than the courtroom. As they parted ways that evening, Alexis left him with a simple yet profound thought. True justice isn't about enforcing laws. It's about making sure those laws serve everyone equally. Richards watched her walk away, her words lingering in the air. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing. Alexis Mitchell had just opened a door he hadn't even realized was there. The following days found Judge Richards in a state of quiet reflection. Alexis Mitchell's words from their conversation at the charity gala echoed in his mind with a persistence he couldn't ignore. True justice isn't about enforcing laws. It's about making sure those laws serve everyone equally. He had heard similar sentiments before, but something about the way Alexis spoke, so calmly, yet so firmly, pierced through his usual defenses. For the first time in his career, Richards felt the weight of his decisions in a way that went beyond the cold application of the law. It wasn't that he didn't care about justice. He had dedicated his entire life to it. But his understanding of justice had always been rooted in the idea that the law, as it was written, was an objective truth. The law was meant to be impartial, unyielding. But now, doubts began to creep in. Could the law, as it stood, truly be fair? Or had it become a tool that upheld systemic inequalities, quietly favoring those with privilege while leaving others to fend for themselves? Richards knew that some of the cases he had ruled on in the past had been straightforward, clear violations of the law that warranted punishment. But now, he wondered if he had ever truly examined the broader context of those cases. Were the sentences he handed down truly just? Or had they been influenced, even unknowingly, by biases built into the very system he believed in so strongly? To process his growing unease, Richards took an unusual step. He attended one of Alexis's public workshops. He had been hesitant at first. What would the other judges think if they found out? What would his colleagues say about his sudden interest in reformist movements? But the curiosity that had been building within him over the past few weeks was stronger than his doubts. The workshop was held at a community center, and it was far different from the sterile environments Richards was accustomed to. The room was filled with people from all walks of life, listening intently as Alexis and other speakers discussed the flaws they saw in the justice system. Alexis spoke with the kind of clarity and passion that Richards had never encountered in a courtroom. She wasn't just criticizing the system. She was offering concrete solutions, ideas for making the system more inclusive, more responsive to the needs of all people. Richards watched as Alexis engaged with the audience. She didn't speak down to them or talk over their heads. Instead, she listened, really listened, to their concerns. She asked questions, encouraged dialogue, and emphasized the importance of empathy and legal reform. It was clear that Alexis wasn't just fighting for abstract ideals. She was fighting for the people in that room, for the individuals who had been let down by the system time and time again. As the workshop ended, Richards felt a profound shift within himself. He realized that he had been viewing the law from a narrow, limited perspective. His role as a judge had always been about administering justice based on the written word, but what Alexis had shown him was that justice was not just about rules. It was about people. It was about ensuring that everyone, regardless of their background or circumstances, had an equal shot at fairness. On his drive home, Richards thought about his own work, his decisions, and whether he had been part of the problem all along. It was clear now that if he truly wanted to make a difference, he couldn't remain passive. He needed to be part of the solution, part of the change Alexis had already set in motion. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, Richards was certain of one thing. His journey had only just begun. As the weeks passed, Judge Richards's internal conflict grew. The questions Alexis had planted in his mind refused to fade. Could the law, as it stood, be enough? Could the systems of justice he had long trusted really be serving everyone equally? The doubts that once seemed like fleeting thoughts had solidified into a persistent unease that Richards could no longer ignore. He had always thought of himself as a man of principle, someone who followed the law with a sense of duty. But now, standing at the crossroads of his career and conscience, he felt the need to reassess his own beliefs. He started researching the topics Alexis had brought up: mass incarceration, racial disparities in sentencing, the school-to-prison pipeline, and the systemic biases embedded in the justice system. He read books, attended public forums, and spoke to experts. Each new piece of information only deepened his discomfort with the status quo. Richards was no longer content with merely administering the law. He now wanted to understand it, to understand its flaws and its impact on the people who came before him in court. One evening, sitting at his desk in the quiet of his chambers, Richards made a decision. He would revisit the fine he had imposed on Alexis Mitchell, the very fine that had set him on this path of questioning. He would take a public step to acknowledge that the judgment had been wrong. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the broader principles at stake. Alexis had stood in front of him that day, advocating for a future where the system worked for everyone, not just the few. And he had dismissed her, but that was going to change. The next morning, Richards issued a public statement. He announced that he would be revisiting the fine, acknowledging that his initial decision had not taken into account the larger social issues at play. He expressed regret for not considering Alexis's deeper message, and he pledged to reconsider the broader implications of his role as a judge. It was a moment of profound vulnerability for Richards, a rare instance where he admitted that perhaps the law wasn't enough to deliver true justice. He was, in that moment, opening himself to change. The response was immediate. The public took notice, and the media began to cover his statement extensively. Many applauded him for his willingness to admit his mistake and for taking a stand for fairness. Others were skeptical, wondering whether it was just a political move or if he truly meant it. Alexis, however, responded with grace. In a statement, she thanked Richards for his openness and acknowledged that real change begins with the willingness to listen and learn. She invited him to collaborate on future initiatives aimed at reforming the justice system. Initiatives that would not only address the flaws in the law but also build trust between the system and the communities it served. For Richards, the decision was more than just an apology. It was a turning point. He could no longer ignore the fact that the law, in its current form, needed reform. But he had also realized that he was no longer an outsider to the conversation. He was now part of it. And in this moment of self-reflection, Richards understood that he could contribute more to the cause than he had ever imagined. This was just the beginning. There was much work to be done. And for the first time, he felt ready to walk that road alongside Alexis Mitchell. In the months that followed Judge Richards's public statement, a transformation began to take shape, both within himself and within the wider community. The media attention he had received for revisiting his decision to fine Alexis Mitchell became a turning point, not just for him, but for others who had quietly questioned the very system they served. It sparked conversations among his colleagues, some of whom had been skeptical of Alexis's movement, and others who, like Richards, had begun to see the flaws in the system but hadn't known where to start. Richards didn't expect an immediate radical change in the courts. He understood that deep-rooted shifts would take time, but he felt a growing sense of purpose, one that he hadn't felt in years. As he began to engage more deeply with reform initiatives, he discovered that his role as a judge was not confined to the courtroom. He could be an advocate for change from within the system, using his position to not only apply the law, but also to challenge it when necessary, to push for reforms that would make it more just and equitable for all. Alexis's impact on him was undeniable. She had opened his eyes to a new perspective, but it was her willingness to engage with the system, rather than tear it down entirely, that had inspired him. She was not just protesting injustice. She was working tirelessly to change it from the inside, creating a platform for communities to voice their concerns and pushing for policies that would ensure true equality. Together, Alexis and Richards started working on initiatives to improve the relationship between law enforcement and marginalized communities. They held public forums, bringing together citizens, activists, police officers, and lawmakers to discuss solutions. Alexis led workshops focused on understanding the roots of systemic racism, while Richards provided insight into the legal process, helping people navigate the complexities of the system they had long felt alienated from. They worked with local schools to create programs that emphasized the importance of justice and civic engagement, encouraging young people to get involved and advocate for change. Over time, Richards became a more active voice in the legal community, advocating for policies that would address racial disparities in sentencing, encourage restorative justice practices, and ensure that all individuals, regardless of their background, had equal access to legal representation. He began speaking at conferences, sharing his journey and the lessons he had learned from Alexis. He openly admitted that the system he had once unquestioningly upheld had its flaws, and it was up to people like him, people in positions of power, to correct those wrongs. The partnership between Alexis and Richards wasn't without its challenges. There were still critics who viewed their efforts with suspicion, arguing that the system could never change. But the momentum was undeniable. Their work began to make a difference, slowly but surely, and with every new initiative they launched, more voices joined the cause. In the end, Judge Richards learned that true justice wasn't a fixed concept. It wasn't something that could be measured by the letter of the law alone. It was something that had to be continually sought, something that required empathy, introspection, and the willingness to evolve. And as he stood side by side with Alexis Mitchell at the front of a packed town hall meeting, answering questions from a new generation of leaders and reformers, Richards knew that this was only the beginning. Together, they were shaping the future of equal justice, one step at a time.